Hi, I'm Peter Rao.
And I am Mike Doran.
Welcome back to Counterbalance.
Peter, you just got back from Ukraine and Moldova.
Which explains our absence last week. Apologies to our viewers and listeners.
I know there's a lot of disappointment out there. Millions of people felt that their week was not complete.
They knew they were missing something, but they were wondering what.
And now we're going to give them a double dose. Moldova and Ukraine.
We're going to please them.
So tell me, what was your big takeaway from? Let's start with Moldova. You went there first, right?
Right.
Most people, I mean, not our listeners, because our listeners are, of course, the best educated people in the world. But
men and women of letters.
Men and women of letters and also of affairs. Men of affairs. Men and women of affairs. But there are people out there who don't really know why Moldova matters. So let's start with that. Moldova is sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania.
That's right. It's a small country, one of, if not the poorest in all of Europe. And Moldova's politics have really been compressed by the war in Ukraine. It's accelerated some of the choices it's had to take or needs to take in the year ahead, whether or not it continues a process of Western integration, which Maya Sandu, the president, has laid out, or whether or not that stalls and even reverses. There are a couple of important dates on the horizon. Most important, the referendum in the fall on EU accession, as well as the presidential election, and then the parliamentary election next year, which will, I think, in large part be shaped by the presidential election this fall. But the point being, setting those mechanics of politics aside, that Moldova is sort of a frontier state in the competition between Russia and the West. Its enclave or its region of Transnistria has been Russian occupied for decades. There are about 15 to 2,500 Russian troops in that area. The right bank of the Dniester River, as they call it, so something that you'll recognize right and left bankers from the Middle East. The right bank, which is the Chisinau-controlled, more western-looking part of Moldova, and the left bank of the river, which is the Transnistria part of Moldova, have very different passport holders, among other things. And so you really feel the kind of frontier quality of Moldova. In talking with officials in Chisinau, had Putin's original war gambit worked out, had he taken Odessa, had he blown through Ukraine, he would have linked up with Transnistria, which borders Ukraine, and potentially moved, they're convinced, into the rest of Moldova, which would have posed some interesting questions because
that would put him on the border of Romania then, and he would control the a big part of the Black Sea, more of the Black Sea.
Well, there's Moldova doesn't itself border the Black Sea, but it obviously is a Black Sea basin state, and beyond that, something like 30 to 40% of right bankers have Romanian citizenship. There's a dual passporting, and so
what language
you can imagine. Well, it's a bunch of different language. Romanian is spoken heavily. There's some Russian speaking in Transnistria. It's a heavily Russian speaking area. Gagauzia, which is a kind of a Turkish region in the south. There's some Turkish branch tree sort of language there, although that's apparently dying out, and it's also Russian and Romanian in large part. But the point being, imagine sitting in Bucharest and watching Putin connect his forces in Ukraine up with Transnistria and then potentially moving in thousands of Romanian passport holders killed or moving into Romania. It's an open question of whether or not Bucharest wouldn't have tried to move in altogether and create a buffer, or if Moldova wouldn't have gone for reunification. Much like there are open questions of whether or not the Poles would move in to create a buffer in western Ukraine if Putin had succeeded and moved toward Lviv. So in any event, its entire security situation is dependent on the war in Ukraine. And so long as the Russians are kept at bay, they can't take Odessa, their Black Sea fleet is pushed back, Moldova's a bit more comfortable, and if the trajectory worsens or if Ukraine falls altogether, then the Romanians and the Moldovans will grow very nervous.
Wow, I can see it. So it really looks like a stack of dominoes there if Ukraine goes down. The why now? How many troops are in Transnistria?
About 2,500 at the high end estimate, 1,500 at the lower end.
Why don't the Ukrainians move in and try to take them out?
So that's a theory that would be a splash play that the Ukrainians could attempt to try to knock the Russians off their pedestal. the type of operation you could see timed to like the Russian presidential election to really shift headlines and to stick it to Putin. But I'm told that the Russians made very clear to the Americans and to the Moldovans, once they realized that they weren't going to be able to unite their troops with Transnistria, that should anything happen to this now isolated enclave, because again, the Russian forces aren't able to unify with it, and Russian hostility is now open for the world and for Ukraine to see, if Ukraine moved on them, that there would be strategic consequences for the rest of Moldova, which was interpreted as like a bombing air campaign against Chisinau or other places.
But that wouldn't. But how? Okay, so they would. What would they would? Okay, they would fly across the Black Sea, but they would have to fly into Ukrainian airspace, wouldn't they? I need to look at a map.
But there are standoff strikes. I mean, the Russians just hit Odessa from Crimea with ballistic missiles overnight and in recent days and weeks. So they regularly run strikes from far off. I mean, remember the kind of strikes they've even hit the Middle East from the Caspian and so forth. So it's within the Russian realm of capabilities.
There was
I'd also add, I mean, this is one area where you can see the world beginning to take lessons from Ukraine. The Moldovans don't have a lot of money. Again, they're very poor. And in domestic politics, you oftentimes hear the argument, why spend on the military if we can't stand up to the Russians anyways? We might as well use that for pensions, et cetera. But the one thing that the Moldovans have bought that's rather expensive is the GM200 Thale air radar. So air defenses, air radars, anti-drone capabilities, this stuff's in high demand in the West.
I laughed when you said that. I remember from my youth when I first started getting interested in international affairs, there was a prime minister in Denmark who talked about this and said, "Who are we kidding? We're a tiny country. If the Russians take over Europe, what are we going to do? We're going to put a record on a turntable and play on loudspeakers all over the country. We surrender. We surrender. We surrender." I remember that caused a lot of. You got a lot of criticism for that from the United States. Let's imagine.
But can I just make a point about that?
Please.
A serious point. Because the conventional threat to Moldova is not non-existent, but it's not feasible for the Russians to actually move into Moldova right now. The real fear in Chisinau on the right bank of the Dniester is just a massive increase in hybrid operations. And here, we've already seen the Russian playbook at least once or twice try to execute what are borderline Russian-style coups, where you gin up a lot of instability, suggesting the government can't handle stability and kind of handle its own affairs, and then you try to empower pro-Russian forces to begin to move
like
against
they've done
it.
in Georgia.
And then they prey on, for example, Maya Sandu, the president I mentioned earlier, who's pro-Western and wants to transition Moldova more towards a market economy as we understand it in the West. That cuts up against still the paternalistic attitudes hanging over from the Soviet era. And so the Russians will encourage one group after another to make demands for subsidies, which are impossible to meet, and then put people into the streets. And the thinking is, beginning in April, there'll be a dramatic increase in spike again in protest to try to weaken her. They've also used Russian TV.
Didn't she? My memory is hazy, but about a year ago, someone, I think it was her, made a statement about having sort of discovered the Russian plan. No. And there was a discussion about the whole Russian plan for destabilizing Moldova.
There was a Montenegrin coup years ago. There might have been a Moldovan one
maybe
too,
it came out right after the invasion of Ukraine. There was discussion of this.
Yeah, and the Moldovans have improved their border security. They've begun to crack down on some nefarious tools that Russian or Russian-aligned groups use. Like, for example, sports teams, because you can get young military-aged men who are sort of hooligans to rampage. But Russian state TV has also been a huge, huge asset for the pro-Russian forces in Russia because there's so many Russian speakers. The Moldovan government's shut that down, but now Telegram is the new Russian TV, and that's the new kind of channel of influence. And basically the modus operandi is to throw as much misinformation at the wall, see what sticks, and then to channel all of your resources into that propagandistic direction. And that's kind of been how the Russians have operated. So we'll see. I mean, there are three blocks in Moldovan politics or parliament. There's a communist and socialist bloc, which you can imagine is not sympathetic towards the West. Then there's this oligarch dominated. He's now a fugitive residing in Jerusalem. Elon Shore set of parties or party that also tends to be pro-Russian, but he's really kind of a mercenary and just interested in making money and growing his own wealth. And then there's Maya Sandu, who's considered to be about as good as it gets.
The guy in Jerusalem, I assume he's Jewish.
Yeah, and
because Moldova was the center of Jewish life.
Yeah,
prior to the Holocaust.
Yeah, so that's kind of the general state of play in Moldova. The one other thing that's really interesting, which I knew nothing about, the Transnistrians receive gas from Gazprom, almost 100%.
How does it get there?
Through
Across Ukraine?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
it's still flowing.
It's still flowing, but the transit agreement is due to expire this year.
And the Ukrainians haven't cut it because why?
Well, and Zelensky has signaled he's not necessarily going to re-up the transit agreement, which could cause massive problems in Moldova because the Transnistrian way is to take that money, provide it at cheap, subsidized prices to their own people, and then to sell it to the rest of Moldova at elevated prices. So that funds their own state budget. They also have like energy-intensive industries like the Moldovan steelworks, which are like half of the GDP for Transnistria. So you can see how this kind of marriage almost works for Chisinau, though, too, because while they're very proud of gotten off of Russian gas very early in the war, they still purchase Russian gas that's been refined in Transnistria.
It's just
and so now they're trying to build new connectors to Romania, but they don't have any high voltage connectors, which is now underway, and that won't be done until 2025, but this agreement might expire in 2024. So this marriage of Moldovan money and Transnistrian gas, which has kind of worked well to stabilize the country, might go head to it for an ugly divorce later this year, and then all bets are off.
And it will be replaced with what?
Who knows? I mean, when the right bank, when Chisinau moved off of Russian gas, the Romanians for a while and the Europeans subsidized their electricity. But, there are like people in Chisinau who moved to Transnistria for the winter because utilities are 25% cheaper. So, and then what's going to happen to the Transnistrians? There's already some protests in recent weeks because there's been some changes to, I think, some tax policy. So they have to pay a little bit more. They still don't have to pay a VAT like the right bank does. If all of a sudden this gas stops flowing and Transnistria can't essentially function, then you can imagine, there being an exodus of people from there too. And
so what are people in Brussels thinking about this, or Washington for that matter?
Well, Brussels has thought about starting accession talks this summer with Moldova. That's pretty much its primary point of focus.
Has thought about or has decided?
Well, they've decided to open accession talks, but the timing is the real question. And Moldova would like to start soon, and the Europeans, perhaps owing to the European elections,
they've decided to talk sometime.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And I'm not sure Washington really has thought all that much about Moldova.
But it's actually, now that you've explained it to me, it's actually more important than one might think.
Right.
With the Russians there, this is, if the war, we can see, when we'll move to Ukraine in a second, but if the war goes badly for Ukraine, this could all of a sudden...
It goes badly for Moldova.
It goes badly for Moldova, then it goes really badly for Romania.
Right. And then it goes badly for NATO.
Yeah.
Which includes us. The other, while it's going badly...
Is that why you went there?
I confess we went there because I'd never been there, so I was interested in going, but also because Ukraine is
You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to tell our viewers that you went there on a lark.
Well, no, I went there because I'd never been there, but also because we were heading to Odessa.
No, you're supposed to say it's strategically important.
Yeah. Well, it's strategically important, and that's why I went. But also, it's 3 or 4 hours drive to Odessa, whereas... and then we went to Kyiv and trained out. But the train ride from Kyiv to the Polish border is like 10 hours. So it makes it slightly easier. And, because there's no commercial air travel into Ukraine right now. So you have to figure out your ground lines of communication, so to speak. But you can see that Putin intended to take the country, Ukraine, because those troops in Transnistria are now stuck. They can't rotate them out either. The airfield's not in use. And if they...
I was going to ask about that, about how they resupply them.
Yeah, if they take an officer out, then, and they try to bring a new one in, the Moldovans will deny them the rotation. So they essentially have this dilapidated force with an aged ammunition dump and an unusable airfield and, 22 2,000 troops or so.
I'll tell you what, though, if you're a Russian soldier,
that's the place to be.
That's the place to be. You're sitting there thinking, I really,
right.
Where did you spend the Ukraine war?
You're
in
sending,
Transnistria.
You're sending one report home about how the situation's on the cusp of deteriorating, and you really need to stay here and patrol because
very important.
That's right.
Very important mission.
Yeah, that's right. And Moldova is also like a smuggling paradise. I mean, Transnistria, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but like it imports like some insane number, like 10,000 cigarettes per person, because it's all smuggled onto the European Union. I think 13% of illicit cigarettes in Europe all come from Transnistria. And then there's this big conglomerate, the Sheriff conglomerate, named after this KGB agent who labeled himself the Sheriff back in the day, who controls kind of supermarkets, liquor stores, but also trades and forged passports and documents and all sorts of goods.
He controls supermarkets and gas stations in Transnistria or elsewhere as well?
Transnistria. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I kind of want to go there now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place.
You didn't go to Transnistria, though?
No, we did not. Yeah.
So you just
there's an administrative border that's apparently like a toll booth. You can just enter and exit. But given Hudson Institute's reputation and status in Moscow, we thought maybe it's best to just head to Odessa.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to
let's cross the border.
Let's cross the border to Ukraine. So you were in Odessa.
I was.
I'm very jealous. I've always wanted to go to Odessa.
Yeah.
Why do you look at me like that?
Well, I didn't know if that was a question.
Oh no. Tell us about Odessa.
Yeah. So Odessa is a beautiful city, and it's recovered quite impressively. Thanks mostly to the opening of the commodity exports, which were locked up. Putin early on had tried to choke off the Ukrainian economy, which is basically the port of Ukraine. And then the Turks negotiated this Istanbul
the
grain
port
initiative.
of Odessa.
Yeah, sorry, the port of Odessa. And the Turks then negotiated this grain deal, which opened up the port of Odessa. Russians then reneged, and Odessa was under regular fire. At that point, the Ukrainians targeted, I think in the span of 24 hours, 2 Russian tankers, and suddenly the Russians backed off of the port of Odessa. So it's still getting hit by Shaheeds. We were there, a ballistic missile hit. I think there have been some hits in the last 48 hours, so it's not,
you heard it hit?
Clear. We heard it hit, yeah. I'm not sure I'm supposed to admit that on camera. Mrs.
Why?
Walters isn't listening to this, I hope.
Oh, I see.
But
I see. Yeah.
But
it focuses the mind, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I was in Baku when Putin shot a ballistic missile at me. Why?
Yeah.
No.
Anyways, so when Putin targeted me, I mean, there was also the minor detail of Zelensky and Mitsotakis, the Greek prime minister, were in Odessa, but I'm pretty sure
you're now in an elite, an elite
club.
Group, the elite club, the people who have had Putin shoot ballistic missiles at them.
So, in any event, when the Ukrainians then targeted Russian exports, and the Russians, for them it's very important. Ideally, they'd bottle up Odessa, drive up prices, steal Ukrainian grain, and then add to that their own exports and make a lot of money. But when they realized that the Ukrainians were saying, we can target you, and if we can't export, neither will you, all of a sudden, some of the pressure the Odessans believe went away. And then ever since, I think since the end of the grain deal, have put out 29 million tons. During the grain deal, it was something like 30 or 32 million tons. Those numbers might be somewhat off, but I think that's more or less right. So important is sea travel and the ocean and the Black Sea to Odessa. When they cut the deal, and then on August 1st, the first ship went out and 3 times blew its horn. The whole city stopped apparently, and people were rather emotional walking around. And again, the port is open, the commercial port. We couldn't go down the commercial port; it's all very secure and protected. But we met with municipal officials and port authorities and others that gave us a sense. The Southern Command.
This is, of course, has to be a vital interest. Well, I don't know. Vital means you're ready to go to war, but it has to be the top interest of the United States with respect to Ukraine. Any settlement, whatever the settlement is with Russia, if there ever is one, has to ensure the inviolability and viability of Odessa. Am I right?
Otherwise, Odessa becomes a landlocked. Ukraine becomes like landlocked Mongolia minus the natural riches, given that many of those are in occupied Russian territory, dependent upon euros and dollars to limp along, which is actually a more expensive prospect.
Which is what Putin wants. He wants to turn it. He wants to turn it into
very much so. And if you exit out through Poland, like we did, you see the choke points. I mean, you cannot through truck traffic, through big rigs, supply a country of that size. I mean, there's just big queues and all the rest. So it has to go, I think, through the port. And Ukraine has something like 18 ports. 5 were taken under Russian occupation in 2014 when they annexed Crimea. And then Ukraine has liberated Kherson and Mykolaiv, remained free, but they can't use those because they're Russian positions that are sort of in the way. But they have several ports that are now operational that allow them. Of course, the Sea of Azov is now Russian, but they still have a number of ports that they can use. But that's one. If you speak to Southern Command, which is the command controlling the south of Ukraine and also looking out into the Black Sea because they have no navy, they are winning the battle for the Black Sea. They may be struggling on land, but one reason why that ballistic missile hit when it did in Odessa, when the Greek Prime Minister and Zelensky were visiting, 1, to say hello to Zelensky, but 2, because yet again, the Ukrainians had sunk a Russian patrol boat the night before with a sea drone. So they are using very creative and impressive methods to go after Russian ships, and step by step, they are sinking the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which of course can't be resupplied because of the Montreux Convention, which Turkey has invoked.
So that's I was gonna make that point.
Make it.
Being a Turkophile, I was annoyed by when the Turks activated, or I don't know what the right word is, the Montreux Convention. There was a ton of very bad analysis in American media saying that this was a pro-Russian step, but we now see that it has really worked in the long run. It has worked so activated the Montreux Convention, which means that the Russians cannot bring ships into the Black Sea.
So it's unclear exactly what the Turks have done. If they've invoked Article 19, which doesn't allow warships without being home ported in the Black Sea to enter the Turkish Straits or to pass them, that's one interpretation. But there is, I think, speculation that in fact they view it as Article 21. Nothing comes in or out. That's a warship. So some of these ships that the Russians could withdraw theoretically and test, there are questions whether or not Ankara would even allow them, to exit, and they certainly wouldn't allow another country, another warship to come in that's being flagged, reflagged as a Black Sea Fleet, or maybe they'd allow that, and then they say, by the way, Washington, if you'd like to donate to the Bulgarians and to the Romanians a warship that's going to be now home ported at Constanza or at I don't know, the port of Burgas or wherever in Bulgaria and Romania, I could see the Turks playing that. So they've definitely have their foot on the windpipe of the Russian Black Sea Fleet for sure.
Great. Now, you said Ukraine does not have a navy. I thought it had a small navy.
Well, it scuttled whatever it had.
Did it?
The first days of the war.
I was not aware of that.
Almost, yeah.
Oh, so it has no navy.
Which just shows they thought Odessa they're about to land.
But they have these drones.
Yeah, and offshore missile strikes that they're executing and so forth.
The drones that they have, are those Ukrainian manufactured? Or are they getting them from us or someone else?
I don't know the exact details of all of that. I do know that the Ukrainians had a very small drone program in 2022, like a few models, a few companies, churning out low numbers. They now have... But
these are, I'm talking about
sea drones.
Or sea drones, yeah.
Now they have 8 different categories of drones, like long-range strike drones, FPV drones. Sea drones would be, one of these or 2 of these categories. And they have large numbers of companies churning out huge numbers of models. And the question is, do they have the actual money to be able to invest and resource the capabilities which they're developing? So I shouldn't speak out of turn. Our colleague Brian Clark would know more, but there are component parts of these drones that are not Ukrainian. Like the 4 rotors on an FPV drone are Chinese, for example, because of low labor costs. So if you build a fleet of 1 million FPV first-person view drones, you need 4 million little engines.
I don't know what FPV is.
First-person view.
What does that mean?
That means you have almost like a video game console, and you're guiding from first-person view. You've probably seen these videos on the internet of drones crashing into tanks.
Yeah.
So those are first-person view. So those might just be camera laden.
As opposed to what? What is that? How does that differentiate it from other kinds of drones?
Well, I don't think they're steered like with like a. I mean, these are like steered like a video game, as I understand it, versus like the Predator is not a first-person view drone.
Okay, I see what you're talking about.
But anyways, yeah, you can. Their Sea drone program is very impressive, and then they've also used their domestically made Neptune missiles, and they've, I think, creatively matched up different types of systems to create overarching capabilities, like their Franken-SAMs, as they call them, for example. That's obviously not as much in the Black Sea, but they're also slowly winning the battle in the air. I mean, they've taken down a lot of planes of late.
That's great to hear, but my impression is that they're losing the war.
So
is that because of the question of resupply?
Yeah,
is that a too crude of an assessment?
I'd say the trajectory for them is negative, but there's a difference between a negative phase and losing and having lost the war. I would just say that. And one thing the Ukrainians reminded me of, which is a great point, people always think of the hardiness of the Russian peoples. These are tough people who have endured a lot and they're willing to go on to the end. The Ukrainians reminded us, we suffered more per capita than any Soviet socialist republic during World War II. We experienced the famine in the 1930s. When you talk about the toughness of the Russian people, like, we can take a punch as well. And the determination to stay in the fight is real. Having said that, they're husbanding and marshaling ammunition down to like single shot, like declining into automatic fire because they need to ration apparently even small arms file. That might just be hearsay, but it's something I heard. They're clearly low on artillery, 155. They have yet to get in sufficient numbers of the right type of long-range fire to be able to take on Russian resupply and the Russian industrial war machine. So they say to us, we ran a successful we won the Battle of Kyiv. We ran successful counteroffensives, won the Battle of Kherson, won the Battle of Kharkiv. And now we ran another counteroffensive where you said you don't have air cover. They didn't have F-16s, which they're getting now. You don't have long-range strike. You can't use American and European systems to strike into the Russian Federation, so the Russians can sunbathe on their side of the border. And then you say, well, why didn't you guys succeed in your counteroffensive? Like, what's going on? Why are you so slow? So they say, look, just take the handcuff off. Give us enough artillery. Give us enough weapons. We don't expect you to put boots on the ground or to fight. And we can, stabilize the front lines and then begin again to go on offense and liberate at some point these territories. That's the argument that they'll make. I will say one thing that's interesting about these sorts of trips. So I went with John Walters, our president and CEO. And when you go with the boss, he gets meetings with other bosses. So we're very honored to meet with people close to the president. At the same time, when you meet with people close to prime ministers and presidents, you get a lot of analysis that you've heard from the president or the prime minister. Right. And so they're very much so expressing, I think, the confidence that President Zelensky has in their war effort. Whereas I think there might be some other voices in the country that would say, look, we're not going to get to 1991 lines tomorrow, but step by step over time, we'll get there. And as one official put it to us, in a very kind of tense moment, I thought he was speaking about us, but he said, look, there's nothing I fear in life except for one thing, and that's betrayal. And we will never forgive for 100 years what the Russians did to us. And when we visited a rocketed apartment building, there was a funeral ongoing outside for this woman. Next to her were pictures of an even younger woman with her child.
This is in Odessa?
In Odessa. And you look at these people's faces. In Odessa, previously founded by Catherine the Great, a Russophile city, these people will never forgive. And you felt it and you saw it. So they're going to fight, but they need the systems to be able to hang on and then potentially turn the tide on land, not just in the air and on water.
Yeah, you mentioned that. You mentioned that it was built by Catherine the Great. It was a jewel in the crown of the Russian Empire. And were there?
An intelligence official we met with said that it's a particular fascination of Putin's, more so than perhaps some other parts of
Odessa.
Of the Kremlin. Yeah, and Ukraine writ large, but Odessa.
My view of every Russian leader is that they have their basic view of international relations is they have a coloring book, and it has the parts of Russia that were traditionally part of the Russian Empire, and the parts of Russia that have been taken away from the Russian Empire. And you're a successful leader of Russia if you get to color in those parts that were taken away.
Right.
And Odessa has got to be one of those ones that he really wants to color in.
Although Putin always says the borders of the Russian Empire don't end.
no, but still
I understand. Yeah.
They have Bakersfield isn't on the on the radar.
I was
by the way, Bakersfield is not on anyone's radar. I apologize to all the people, all our listeners in Bakersfield who are proud of their home.
Thousands of Bakersfield's viewers and listeners. One anecdote I heard a few years ago, I might have already said it on the show, but there was this very senior aide to I think it was a foreign minister of a Baltic state, maybe an undersecretary or something like that. And he relayed to me this conversation he had with Alexander Dugin, this chief ideologue out of the Kremlin, a Russian nationalist par excellence. And almost over pizza, sort of a casual setting, he said, where does the Russian Empire end? And Dugin, without missing a beat, says, wherever you stop us.
Right, exactly.
So that is sort of the Russian attitude.
That is the Russian view. Yeah. So your big takeaway with regard to, first of all, your big takeaway with regard to this question of winning or losing?
I would say that...
did you come away depressed, or did you come away thinking things are going well?
I think it more or less met my analytical expectations, which is to say, I don't think things are going well. It's grim. It's difficult. There is anxiety. But it would be probably catastrophic. It would be catastrophic if the West walked away altogether for the Ukrainians. But I don't think that Ukraine is on the brink of total collapse either.
So what do you think if we had Jake Sullivan here, National Security Advisor, and we put truth serum into him, what would he say about your concerns?
He would say that, number one, if Ukraine goes down, right now there's little political pressure on Biden because, like in the 1950s debating China, they will say that it's the Republicans who lost Ukraine.
So he's thinking about it purely in American domestic political terms, not thinking about it as a strategic failure.
Well, I just think he's sensitive and attentive to politics. And if a president is under severe political pressure, it will in part shape his calculus. And I think if they're not feeling that, they are more or less positioned in a place of comfort. So they will say on the one hand, they're the foaming at the mouth hawks like Peter Rao. Not that I register on their on their radar, although they do all watch the show. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they're the pure isolationists, who want to cut off Ukraine altogether. And they like to present this to the press and to the American public very savvy. We're the sensible adult moderates sort of in the room.
Yeah.
Truth be told. So number one, I think he doesn't feel any political pressure.
That's also how they see themselves.
Yeah, very much so. Secondly, I would say that they, in the end, feel very uncomfortable with Ukrainian defeat and Ukrainian victory. They feel uncomfortable with Ukrainian defeat because even though it's the Republicans who lost Ukraine, they will have the stain of Afghanistan, the stain of Gaza, and now the stain of Ukraine to contend with as well. And they don't really want that heading into re-elect or really for the history books writ large. But they also don't feel comfortable with Ukraine charging into Crimea or up to
and this is why
Rostov-on-Don.
This is why they put the restrictions on on the artillery.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, they are deterred by Putin's saber rattling. There's no doubt about that. in particular in the nuclear realm. So I think if you gave Jake Sullivan truth serum,
Wait, those are not exactly the same thing.
What?
Well, deterred by Putin's saber rattling and not wanting to empower the Ukrainians.
Well, I think they think if you empower the Ukrainians and they go too far, Putin
Then
might
you do
move
have
up to the nuclear level. That's something they fear. So I think as they see it, rather than risk for the United States and the West a Ukrainian victory that might trigger Putin to lash out, or arrive at a Ukrainian defeat that, again, like Afghanistan, is a blemish on their record, they'd prefer to exhaust both sides into a negotiated outcome. Now, the downside of that is for all of his protestations that he's for Ukraine and professions of love for Ukraine, that strategy bleeds Ukraine white.
Mm-hmm.
And puts an enormous amount of pressure on our domestic politics to sustain a long-term effort until both Russia and Ukraine are sufficiently exhausted to negotiate.
You can't exhaust Russia in this way. You can exhaust Ukraine.
Right. So
this is a recipe for Ukrainian defeat.
That, and then I think
slow, honorable defeat.
Yeah, which again, as long as it's not collapse, they might be okay with. That's a cynical reading, but I think there's a lot of analytical evidence to support it. Moreover, a lot of the polling data shows that the American public, including, by the way, the Republicans, are okay with funding Ukraine. It's at 45% or so, give or take 10 points, depending upon the day, the week, the way the question is asked, which, by the way, is way higher than anything else if you ask Republicans that's so closely identified with Joe Biden. So it's maybe not that big of a sign of weakness. But if connected to that, should we support Ukraine because we have plan X, Y, Z? It's going to deter the Chinese over Taiwan. It's going to keep Putin from going into other NATO states. That number, even amongst Republicans, jumps up to nearly 70% or higher.
So a little bit of presidential leadership on this could...
Presidential leadership connected to a strategy to win, right? So you're not just pumping tens of billions of dollars in for what? For another stalemate negotiations.
It doesn't look like
right.
Yeah.
And so I think if you said to Jake Sullivan, who surely knows the polling and knows this, that your strategy is potentially going to blame the Republicans for the loss of Ukraine, potentially bleed Ukraine white, and thirdly is going to basically give the American people and the right in particular another reason to oppose long-term interventions abroad, he apparently would say that's worth it rather than antagonizing the Russians. And by the way, I also said
they don't really see the world the way we do. They don't see us as in a contest with Russia, China.
Well, here's
and
the
Iran.
other thing I'd say, and I said this to Handelsblatt, the German daily, this week in response to this New York Times piece about nuclear saber rattling. I also think the Americans still want the Russians on certain other files. Right? They don't just talk about Ukraine to the Russians. In fact, they don't talk about Ukraine to the Russians. But I know for a fact
they want them
very
on
well
the
sourced.
They want them on the Iran nuclear file.
But they talk to them on other issues.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so as long as Russia is a nuclear power, they want to potentially, they will always, it's in the Democratic Party DNA, try to trigger disarmament talks of one sort or another. They want them for the regional condominium because Russia is a factor in the Middle East that they're trying to set up with Iran, as you know. And they want them on other issues. So anything from cooperation in, say, the Arctic, that will at some point come again, where that's being pushed for. So I think not only is it trying to avoid Russian escalation, but in the end, it's also this framework of how do we get to win-win cooperation. Now, maybe that's a little bit crude now.
No.
But you know what I'm saying.
No, I know, yeah. No, I have no doubt you're right. Yeah. The one thing, as you know, I have a superpower.
Right.
And it's to understand how Democrats understand the world.
Yeah.
Especially Obama. Okay, so very quickly, if we had the German leadership here and put truth serum into them, what would they think about all this?
Well,
is it identical to Jake Sullivan, or are there differences?
I think it's the same rut of thinking, the same mode of thinking, but it's all the more pronounced. So it's Jake Sullivan on steroids. So think of skinny Jake Sullivan puffed up in a muscle jacket. That's Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany.
Is there anyone in Europe that has real influence that is alarmed by the declining Ukrainian fortunes?
Oh, I think almost all of the Eastern flank countries are concerned about this. I would say that there are very important forces in Germany, in German politics, You'll remember Norbert Röttgen, who you've met
Yes.
with at least once or twice. He just got into a back and forth with Olaf Scholz in the Bundestag, going after him for declining to deliver the Taurus missile, which is a cruise missile along the lines of the ATACMS that could play a major role in, for example, bringing down the Kerch Bridge and thereby really badly damaging Russian resupply and thereby also allowing the Russian Putin's prestige, among other things. So there are very important voices in German opposition politics. There are voices in German government. I'd note that same parliamentary debate, the Greens did not clap along for quite a few of the chancellor's lines, despite being in the coalition. And when Rolf Münzenich, the head of the parliamentary group in the parliament for the SPD, that's the chancellor's party, so he's the floor leader, he's a pacifist, known to be kind of in the left fringe of the party, was waxing eloquent about the importance of peace and all the rest. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, was shaking her head no, so visibly. So there are voices there. Macron has made some very rhetorically strong, even borderline aggressive statements of late, which were welcome in Kyiv.
This changes from month to month with him.
Yeah. Well, in the end, the test there is, what is the actual volume of military supply you're prepared to provide the Ukrainians? It's in the low billions thus far for the French.
What about the British? They're the strongest, staunchest, aren't they?
The Brits are important because they've been willing to lead. So they were the first to put main battle tanks, the Challengers, in. They were the ones with Storm Shadow and Scalp, which is the French equivalent, long-range strike. They're willing to provide the Ukrainians. And they were the ones with NLAWs, or the anti-tank weapon that moved in quickly and aggressively. So every time they've taken those steps, the Americans have followed. And in a way, it's almost like a trial balloon. I don't know if that's how they think of it, but it's provided some cover and it's pulled the president, our president, and the Americans along. So, whereas the Germans are the exact opposite. I mean, they want to shelter under the American umbrella, and they're unwilling to take any steps unless the Americans do it first. And as much as the Germans come in for criticism, I understand that because it is an American-built system. We are the nuclear weapons backstop. And if we're not willing to do it, then the Germans are thinking, well, this is a bit risky for us. So,
I never complain about the Germans because the whole, we created a pacifistic Germany for a reason.
Right.
And so, that's the product of a successful strategy.
Right.
I think the decisions come down to us in the end. Okay. I think we've exhausted everything, haven't we? Do you have any big takeaways from Ukraine that I haven't got out of you?
Probably, but I can't think of what they are right now.
All right. So we'll wait till next time then.
Yeah.
To hear those.
When we welcome ourselves back to Counterbalance.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.